Hello everyone, welcome back to Study Room. In this video, we will be studying about the nervous system in animals. So we have talked about how our movements and our body functions are controlled by the nerves. Okay, and we will be learning here that how this nervous system actually works in animals, what are the units of the nervous system, and everything that is important to know about nervous system. So let us see what we have in store for us. In this video, you can see the nervous system is a communication network of nerve cells that the body uses to transmit information and coordinate bodily functions. It comprises the brain, the hub of sensory and intellectual activity, the spinal cord, and many cranial and spinal nerves. So these are the main portions of the nervous system which are instrumental in doing the functions that are responsible. So let us see what we have in store. The nervous system is the part of an animal's body that coordinates its behavior and transmits signals between different body areas. So nervous system is basically, it helps in the coordination and transmission of the signals in the body. It has two main parts. The first part is CNS and the second part is PNS. CNS means central nervous system, which consists of brain and spinal cord. These are the two components of the central nervous system. And PNS means peripheral nervous system, which consists of all the other nerves of the body. Okay, so here we can see that the central nervous system has brain and spinal cord, and peripheral nervous system has nerves such as cranial and spinal nerves. Okay, and the nerves of the body basically. So let us see what is central and peripheral nervous system. In this diagram, you can see this is the brain and this is the spinal cord, which constitutes the central nervous system or the CNS. In this picture, you can see the different nerves. Okay, we have so many nerves in our body, and these nerves are basically constituting the peripheral nervous system. So these nerves actually help in transmitting the messages from the brain and the spinal cord, that is from the CNS, to different parts of the body, and then again vice versa. Okay, so to and fro movement of the messages from the CNS to the body parts happens through the peripheral nervous system or the other nerves of the body. So let us see the most important and the basic and functional unit of the nervous system, which is the neuron. So neurons are cells within the nervous system that transmit information to other nerve cells, muscle or gland cells. So these neurons are basically cells which are constituting the whole nervous system. Okay, so the nervous system is made up of cells known as neurons, which help in the transmission of information. So you can see here the structure of a neuron. This is the cell body. Okay, this is the nucleus, this major part that is given here. This is the nucleus in between. Then we have the dendrites, these hair-like structure. These are known as the dendrites. This, this cylindrical body is known as axon, and the end bulbs. Okay, these end terminals, these are known as synaptic terminals. So we will be talking about all these structures one by one. Now let us see what is the function of neuron. Neuron is basically a structure which we know that it transmits the signals, and how does it do so? So there are end bulbs or the end terminals, and these end bulbs actually together, the end bulbs of two neurons, they together form a structure known as synapse. Okay, so synapse is a structure that permits a neuron or nerve cell to pass an electrical or chemical signal to another neuron. So here you can see this is a space, and this whole structure here, this is a synapse. So synapse is basically made with the help of the terminal end bulbs of two neurons, between which there is transmission of the messages or electrical or chemical signals. Okay, so the messages are passed on in the form of electrical or chemical signal between the two end terminals of the neurons. Okay, and here you can just see a cartoon or an animated thing that is given here, diagram, where a neuron says, hey, I have some info, and the other neuron says, just synapse it, bro. So this is the same deal that we have here, that one neuron passes the messages to the other neuron with the help of synapse. Neurons are the only cells in the human body that can communicate with each other. So that is a unique feature of neurons. Now we'll be discussing about the parts of the neuron that we studied before in the diagram one by one. So we had this major part that was known as the cell body, also known as a soma. Okay, the cell body is the neuron's core. The cell body carries genetic information, maintains the neuron's structure, and provides energy to drive activities. So we had seen the cell body, right? We had seen the cell body in the previous diagram, where there was this nucleus in between and there were hair-like structures like dendrites. Okay, there were hair-like structures. And this whole portion, okay, and there was this cylindrical portion also. So this portion, okay, this whole portion, this head portion is known as cell body, or better known as cytone. Okay, so this is known as cytone. And what does a cytone do? It has this nucleus situated here centrally, and it carries genetic information, maintains the neuron's structure, and provides energy to drive activities. So these are the functions of the cytone or the cell body. It is also known as soma. Okay. Now we'll be talking about this long cylindrical portion that is known as the axon. Okay, this is known as axon. So cytone and axon. Okay. So what does axon do? It is a long, thin structure in which action potentials or electrical impulses are generated, the transmitting part of the neuron. So axon is basically here, in this portion, what happens, at the beginning of the axon, we have the electric potentials that are generated, okay? And these electric potentials or electric impulse actually carry the messages through the cylindrical body and then passes it on to the synapse and then to the next neuron. So with the help of the cylindrical structure known as axon, we are actually able to transmit the electrical impulses. So this is the work of axon. Now let us see the other structures like dendrites. Dendrites are fibrous roots that branch out from the cell body, as we just saw in the previous diagram that I made, that there are fibrous roots that branch out from the cell body like antenna. Dendrites receive and process signals from the axons of other neurons. Okay, so these dendrites actually receive and process signals from the axons of other neurons and hence are very important portion of the neuron. Okay, nerve cell. Next is nucleus. As we talked, that nucleus is basically carries the genetic information of the cell. Okay, and nerve ending, the branched endings of the cell that transmit signals to the connected cell. So the terminal of the nerve ending constitutes the formation of synapse. Okay, so this is also a very important structure which helps in the transmission of the electrical signals from one neuron to the other. Now we have the types of neuron. Okay, so there are three types of neuron that we can see here. The first is sensory neuron, which is basically helpful in converting a specific type of stimulus via their receptors into axon potentials. Okay, so they basically help in stimulating the axon potentials, and they convert a specific type of stimulus into the axon potentials or the electric signals. Okay, and the second type of neuron that we have is motor neuron. Motor neuron basically transmits impulses from the spinal cord to skeletal and smooth muscles. And what is relay neuron? relay neuron allows sensory and motor neurons to communicate with each other. So what happens is, maybe this is your hand, okay? This is your hand, and a stimulus, maybe a nail is pricked here. So when the nail or when the safety pin is pricked here, the stimulus that is that is created here, the sensory neurons actually receive the stimulus through the receptors and change it into action potentials or electrical signals and takes it to the brain or the spinal cord, right? And then from the brain and or the spinal cord, that is CNS, the signals, the electrical signals, the command signals are again transmitted back through the motor neurons. So sensory neurons take it to, and motor neurons bring it from the CNS to the affecting part, okay? And then only you will be able to move your hand for the reaction, okay? So this is the work that the sensory and the motor neurons do. What is relay neuron? Relay neuron is basically present in the CNS, which helps in connecting the endings of the sensory and the motor neurons. So basically this is the intermediary neuron which helps in connecting the sensory and the motor neuron, okay, and helps in the communication of these two. Now here the diagrams, as we can see, there are three diagrams. The first, this one is motor neuron, this is sensory neuron, and this is interneuron. So these are basically the kinds of neuron that we studied here: sensory neuron, okay, motor neuron, and interneuron. Now, how nervous system or nervous impulses travel in our body, okay? So we need to know step by step that how these nerve impulses actually travel in the body. Although I have just explained about it, but let us see once more and we'll see the steps one by one. The first step is that the information acquired at the end of the dendritic tip of a nerve cell sets off a chemical reaction to create an electrical impulse, okay? So when the dendritic tip, the dendritic tip, it acquires any information, it sets off a chemical response that creates an electrical impulse, okay? And this impulse travels from the dendrite to the cell body and then along the axon to its end, okay? This is the step 2. When it reaches the end, okay, at the end of the axon, the electrical impulse sets off the release of some chemicals, okay? So there is some release of chemicals at the end of the axon, that is at the end bulb, which basically constitutes the synapse. So this is step 3. And now let us see the step 4, that is the final step that we have, where these signals cross the synapse and start a similar electrical response in a dendrite of the next neuron. So this is basically a circular process where the information is received by the dendrite, okay? Then it is transmitted to the cyton, then it is transmitted to the axon, and then it is transmitted to the end bulb, okay? And then it is transmitted to the other neuron through the synapse. So this is basically a flow chart that we can have while writing. While explaining, you can just write this flow chart to explain these 4 steps, okay? So we have the 4 steps. Here you can see in the animated video also that how this signal is transferring from one neuron to the other. So basically a signal is generated in the dendrite and then it travels through the cyton and the axon, and then it passes through the synapse and then to the other neuron, and then it passes on to the other neurons, okay? So this is how this neuron or the nerve cells communicate with each other and transmit impulses. Now we have some brainstorming questions that are asked here. Identify the parts of the neuron where information is acquired. So we will just remember the first step where the information is acquired at the dendrite, right? So dendrite is the part where the information is acquired, through which information travels as an electrical impulse. So information travels as an electrical impulse through the axon, right? Axon is the portion of the cylindrical body, this portion, this is the axon. This is the dendrites. Okay, and where the impulse must be converted into a chemical signal for onward transmission. So this can be the axon ending. Okay, and this basically carries the chemical signals. The impulse is then converted to chemical signal at the axon ending, and these chemical signals are transmitted through the synapse to the other neuron. So this is basically a brainstorming question based on the steps that we have studied for the transmission of messages or transmission of signals through the neurons and how neurons communicate with each other. The next major topic that we'll be studying is neuromuscular junction. So neuromuscular junction, it is in short, it is known as NMJ. It is a highly specialized synapse between a motor neuron, nerve terminal and its muscle fiber. So NMJ, as the name suggests, it is neuro and muscular. So neuro means a motor neuron nerve terminal and muscular means a muscle fiber. Okay, so when a synapse is created, a specialized synapse actually is created between a motor neuron nerve terminal and a muscle fiber, then it is known as the neuromuscular junction. And these are responsible for converting electrical impulses generated by the motor neuron into electrical activity in the muscle fibers. Okay, mitochondria helps in synaptic transmission because it actually provides the energy for the transmission. Okay, and these neuromuscular junctions are basically responsible for converting electrical impulses generated by the motor neuron into electrical activity in the muscle fibers, as it was happening. The electrical impulses at one. If this is a synapse. Okay. This is a synapse. As I studied before, when there was some electrical activity, they were getting transmitted through the synapse to the other neurons. Okay, so in the same way, here what we are having is, this is a neuron. This is neuron. But here what we are having is, this is a synapse and this is a nerve fiber. Okay, this is a nerve fiber. So the electrical signals are actually getting here. This is the neuromuscular junction, where the electrical signals are being transmitted to the muscle fibers. Now we'll be learning about the structure of the neuromuscular junction. Here we have these neurons, that is the neuron endings are present here. Okay, neuron endings, and this is the muscle fiber that we have, right? This is the axon of the motor junction. And this is the muscle fiber that we have. These are the capillaries, the blood capillaries present, and these, the intermediate point here between the space between the nerve ending, the motor nerve ending, and the muscle fiber. This is basically the neuromuscular junction. Okay, here this is a very magnified image of the neuromuscular junction that is given here. We have the presynaptic terminus, we have the synaptic vesicles that are present in the nerve ending of the motor neuron, and this is the membrane of the muscle fiber. This is the membrane of the muscle fiber or the postsynaptic membrane, and these are the mitochondria that provide energy for the transmission of the signals. Okay. We have a question here, that is there a difference in how sugar and food taste if your nose is blocked, and why? So if our nose is blocked, there is of course a difference how sugar and food taste, because the upper part of our nose, okay, the upper part of our nose isn't clear to receive the chemicals that trigger the olfactory receptors if our nose is blocked. Okay, so the chemicals won't be received, and hence the olfactory receptors are the receptors that help in the perception of smell. Okay, so these olfactory receptors won't be triggered, and that is why the brain will not be informed about the flavor, and hence the sensation of the flavor won't be created. So that is why, when the olfactory receptors are not triggered and the brain does not receive the information, the proper information of the sugar and food taste, so the sugar and the food will taste really different compared to what it tastes when the nose is not blocked. So when the nose is blocked, of course there will be a difference in the taste of sugar and food. Next up, we will be studying the controlled movement or response to environment. So controlled movements are our voluntary actions or movements which are controlled and these are based on our environment. Okay, like our brain makes conscious decisions for these movements. So the movements that are controlled by our brain based on our environment is known as, or voluntary actions or movements are known as controlled movements. Okay, for example, kids are playing or football player is running. So these are basically very voluntary activities that we do, which we know that we are doing, and we are doing it with our own will, and our brain is giving making decisions and giving commands for that. So these are basically known as controlled movements. Now we have some questions for brainstorming. First question that we have is, how will we take our hands back if we touch a hot object? So if we touch a hot object, we clearly take our hands back immediately when we touch a hot object. And how long will we take for this action? Of course, we'll take that action for a very short period of time. Very immediately, we will just move back our hand. And who is controlling all these actions of our body? That is a question that we need to study here. We'll be discussing about this question. We'll be discussing about the process of this, immediate action that we take in the upcoming slides. So let's see. We have again some brainstorming questions, that which of the following are reflex actions. So as we discussed the brainstorming questions before, we perform some immediate actions, that when our hand touches some hot surface, then we just immediately remove the hand. That action is known as reflex action. So here, the immediate actions that we do, in response to any stimulus, we have to identify those actions and name them as reflex actions. So blinking of eyes when insects come in contact. Okay, then we have kicking a football. Then we have jumping over a rock. And then we have sudden withdrawing of hands when a pin pricks. So this is basically, these are 4 kinds of movements that are given here, and we have to identify which is a reflex action here. So here we can see that blinking of eyes is a immediate action that we take. Okay, so this is an immediate action, and hence this can be termed as reflex action. Is kicking a football an immediate action? I suppose no, because we take we take voluntary. This is a very voluntary action that we take, right? So kicking a football is not a reflex action, not reflex. Okay, and jumping over a rock, this is also a very controlled action that we do. So this is also not a reflex action. But sudden withdrawing hands when a pin pricks, just before we saw the brainstorming question. So this is also a similar kind of a action that we do, and this is a very immediate response that we show to the stimulus. So this is also a reflex action. So in these 4 actions, we have this and this as reflex action. Now let us see how this reflex actions actually work. It basically works with the help of a reflex arc that is present in our body. The pathway taken by the nerve impulse to accomplish a reflex action is called the reflex arc. So this is the definition of a reflex arc, that the pathway that is taken by the nerve impulse to accomplish a reflex action, that is an immediate action, is known as reflex arc. Now, types of reflex arc. We have 2 types of reflex arc. The first is autonomic reflex arc, and the second is somatic reflex arc. Autonomic reflex arc affects the functioning of the inner organs, whereas somatic reflex arc affects the functioning of the muscles. So these are the 2 types of reflex arcs. Now let us see with the help of a diagram how this reflex arc actually work and what are the parts of the reflex arc. So here as you can see that the stimulus is there. Okay, so the stimulus is mainly heat or pain that we give. Okay, so if the stimulus is heat, then there are receptors present here in the skin that perceive the stimulus such as heat or pain, and then electrical impulses are generated here and they travel through the sensory neuron to the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord. Okay, so these electrical impulses travel to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord we have this motor neuron that helps in bringing the command, the immediate command, to the effector muscle. Okay, so the effector muscle will basically just remove your hand, help you to remove your hand immediately. So this is a very immediate response. It's a very immediate signal that goes and comes from the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord. Okay, it doesn't goes to brain because many times what happens is since this is a very immediate action, then brain is very much far away from your hand, right? So what happens is spinal cord is more nearer. The portion of the spinal cord or the portion of the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord, it is nearer to your hand, and that is why the reflex arc is basically from the spinal cord. Okay, and here in between the sensory and the motor neuron, as we studied the type of neurons before, so here this is the sensory and the in between the sensory and the motor neuron we have the relay neuron or the intermediate neuron. Okay, so we have the intermediate neuron. Next up, we'll be discussing about the parts of the reflex arc or the parts that are discussed here in this reflex arc. We already discussed so many parts, so we'll be just looking over the parts one by one. Okay, so the receptor, as I already said, it is a part of the reflex arc responsible for detecting the stimulus. Sensory neurons, what they do? They convey the sensory information to the brain or the spinal cord, whichever is nearer, and they take the information from the receptor to the CNS. The next we have is motor neuron. It conducts motor output to periphery, and it is a nerve cell formatting part of the pathway along which impulses travel from brain or spinal cord to the gland or muscles. So this is the this is the return path of the command that is given by the CNS. So the command that is given by the CNS travels through the motor neurons and are they are transported to the gland or the effector muscles. Then we have the relay neuron. Relay neurons are basically the interneurons or intermediate neurons. It serves as a processing center and conducts nerve impulses from sensory neurons to a motor neuron. So this is basically relay neurons are connecting neurons between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons and helps in transmission of the messages from the sensory to the motor neuron. The next we have is effector. The cells are muscles or glands that acts in response to the stimuli. So the cells or muscles that acts in the response to the stimuli, those are known as effector muscles or effector cells or effector cells, right? Next here we have, you can see here in animation that how the signal is transferring from this sensory neuron, and then it is reaching the signal is transferring from the sensory neuron, it is reaching the central nervous system, and then from that through the motor neuron it is coming back to the effector muscles. So this is a knee-jerk experiment that we have, that when this hammer is struck on the knee, then the leg automatically responds. Okay, it automatically comes up. So this basically happens with the help of this reflex arc that is created here, right? Now we'll be discussing about knee-jerk experiment a little more. That is also known as a patellar reflex. Okay, so since this region is known as a patella, so this is also known as a patellar reflex. Here, this hammer is stuck on just below the knee or just below the patella. We have the patellar bone here, and just below it, this hammer is stuck. And when at the moment that the hammer is stuck, this leg tends to come up. Okay, so this is a reflex action that happens here, that the leg tends to come up, the lower portion of the leg tends to come up, and this basically happens due to this reflex arc. That here are the muscles, this biceps femoris, and these are the sensory neurons which actually take the stimulus, the electrical signals of the stimulus to the CNS, and from the CNS you have the motor neurons which bring back the command, and it helps to bring the signals which say that the lower part of the leg should go up. So here the muscles that are working are biceps femoris muscles or flexor muscles and quadriceps femoris muscles known as the extensor muscles. So this is basically how a knee jerk reflex action actually works. Now we have the human brain. Okay, so the central nervous system, the main part of the central nervous system we'll be discussing now, that is the human brain. Brain is made up of more than 100 billion nerves that communicate in trillions of connections called synapses. Okay, so brains has so many 100 billion nerves that communicates in trillions of connections called synapses. The communication between the central nervous system and the other parts of the body is facilitated by the peripheral nervous system consisting of cranial nerves arising from the brain and spinal nerves arising from the spinal. So the communication happens between the central nervous system and other parts of the body with the help of the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the other nerves such as the cranial or the spinal nerves, right? The brain is one of the largest and most complex organs in the human body, and one of the most important center of our human body, which helps us to do all the activities that we do in our daily lives. So the brain is really important. In this video, we can see that the brain is the most complex organ in the human body. As part of the nervous system, the brain coordinates all the body's functions. In adult humans, the brain is a 3-pound gelatinous mass of fat and protein. It comprises of 4 main regions: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the diencephalon. And each one controls some specific tasks. Okay, so each of these regions actually controls some specific tasks. The largest section of the cerebrum, and the largest section is made up of the cerebrum, and it makes up over 3/4 of the brain's volume. It consists of neurons and nerve fibers that transmit information from the neurons throughout the brain and body. The cerebrum controls higher functions such as learning, reasoning, and speech, plus senses like sight and hearing. So, cerebrum part of our brain is very important. Okay. Under the cerebrum is the second largest part of the brain, that is the cerebellum. Much like the cerebellum has varied cells under fibers. It carries signals to other parts of the brain and the spinal cord. The cerebellum is responsible for coordinating muscle movements, particularly those that help maintain the body's balance and posture. The third region of the brain, that is the brainstem, it lies in front of the cerebellum and anchors the brain to the spinal cord. The brainstem is a collection of structures that include the pons, a mass of nerve fibers that carry sensory information. The second part that the brainstem has is the midbrain, which is a region of fibers in structures that help control movement along with auditory and visual processing. And the medulla oblongata, which is the third part, which creates motor and sensory pathways between the midbrain, the pons, and the spinal cord. Altogether, the parts of the brain stem control vital bodily functions such as cardiac activity, respiration, digestion, and sleep. The fourth region is located above the brainstem and makes up the core of the brain, that is the diencephalon. About the size of an apricot, the diencephalon is a grouping of several structures. The thalamus, which processes and transmits information from all senses except smell, and the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, which work together to produce and regulate neurochemicals. These structures help govern sensations, weight regulation, energy, and instinctual behaviors such as eating, drinking, etc. The brain's four main components, the diencephalon, brainstem, cerebellum, and the cerebrum, work in synchronization to ensure bodily functions are fully operating. So, the brain has these four components which help in the proper functioning of the brain. Now, this is a diagram of the brain. So here we have the frontal lobe, this is the temporal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, and the occipital and the lobe. So the brain is actually divided into four lobes, as you can see here: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And here you can see the cerebellum and the spinal cord. The brain continues downwards in the spine. Okay. Now we'll be seeing the forebrain. The forebrain consists of cerebellum, thalamus, and hypothalamus, as we just discussed before. This part is responsible for processing sensory information collected by different sensory organs such as eyes, nose, ears, tongue, and skin. So this is a very important part, which is generally concerned with the sensory information, and also responsible for the voluntary muscle movement. So it's a very important part of the brain. The forebrain mainly consists of these three parts: cerebellum, thalamus, and hypothalamus. So you need to remember all the three parts of the forebrain. It's the most important part of the brain, and it distinguishes human from other animals. So cerebrum is really very important. The next part that we have is hindbrain. Okay. So what does a hindbrain do? The hindbrain consists of the pons, cerebellum, and medulla. So it connects the brain to the spinal cord and coordinates many vital functions such as breathing and heartbeat. So hindbrain also has three portions: the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, and it connects the brain to the spinal cord and coordinates many vital functions such as breathing and heartbeat, which are involuntary functions and are really important for our body. The next portion that we'll be talking about is the midbrain. The midbrain is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep and wakefulness, arousal or alertness, and temperature regulation. So these are the activities, or these are the areas with which the midbrain is associated. The midbrain is the forwardmost portion of the brainstem. Okay. Now, protection of brain and spinal cord. So how does the brain and the spinal cord is protected? Skull or cranium, which acts as armor and helps in the shielding of the brain from blows. Okay, so skull is basically the armor that protects the brain, and meninges, which has three membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord to keep it from being damaged by contact with the inside of the skull. So these two things, that the first is skull or cranium and the second is meninges, which helps in the protection of the brain. So meninges are basically the three membranes that we have, and in that these meninges, these membranes are basically the inflammation that is caused in this membrane. A disease is formed which is known as meningitis, which is a very common disease, and it occurs due to the inflammation in these three membranes. Now next is, how is the spinal cord protected? So the spinal cord is basically protected. Here we have this cerebrospinal fluid, which is also known as CFS. Okay, that the brain and spinal cord basically float in. So CSF is also a protective layer for both the brain and the spinal cord. And the vertebral column or backbone, as we know, is a hard, bumpy structure that protects the spinal cord. Okay, so these are basically the very important portions or the very important structure that helps in the protection of the spinal cord, right? Now we'll be talking about the nervous tissues. Okay, now we'll be talking about the nervous tissues and how do they cause action. So when nerve impulses reaches the muscle cells, the muscle fiber move by changing their shape. Okay, and so that they shorten. Muscle cells have special proteins that change both their shape and their arrangement in the cell in response to nervous electrical impulses. So these muscle impulses actually reach the muscle cells and muscle fiber move by changing their shape. By which the contraction and the relaxation of the muscles occur. And muscle cells have special proteins in them like actin, myosin. All these proteins help in the change of both shape and their arrangement in the cell in response to the nervous electrical impulses. When this happens, new arrangement of these proteins give the muscle cells a shorter form, like it contracts and then it relaxes. So when when the proteins when the muscle cells become shorter due to the action of these proteins, then it contracts and then again it relaxes when it comes back to the original shape. You can see here how the nervous tissues do action. The sensory input is you can see here how the nervous tissues do action. We have the hand and we have water in a glass. So when we we hold this water, how do we hold this water? First, we perceive the water, that there is this glass there which is filled with water. We see it, and then the sensory input travels to the brain, and then the motor output, the brain commands the affected muscles here to pick up the glass of water. So this is how the nervous actions that work in our body. Now we'll be discussing the in-text question. The first question that we have is, what is the difference between reflex action and walking? Reflex action is basically an involuntary action. As we know, it is an immediate action, but walking is a voluntary action. Reflex action is controlled by the spinal cord, and walking is controlled by the brain. It is basically controlled by the brain, whereas reflex action can be controlled by the spinal cord. Reflex action can be controlled, whereas walking can be changed or modified. Reflex action cannot be controlled, whereas walking can be changed or modified. Reflex action is spontaneous, while walking is not spontaneous. So these are some of the differences that we can find between reflex action and walking. The next question that we have is, what happens at the synapse between two neurons? The small empty space between two nerve cells is called synapse. At synapse, a chemical substance is produced at the end of axon of one nerve cell that reaches to the other nerve cell through the dendrite. Thus, information is transmitted from one nerve cell to the other nerve cell by synapse. So, synapse is basically helpful in communication between two neurons. The next question that we have is, which part of the brain maintains posture and equilibrium of the body? As we discussed before also, that cerebellum part of the brain, it is a part of the hind brain which deals with or which coordinates the voluntary movements and controls equilibrium and posture of the body. The next question that we have is, how do we detect the smell of an agarbatti or incense stick? The smell of an agarbatti or incense stick diffuses in the air gently, and it is detected by the olfactory receptors that are present in our nose. This information is sent to olfactory lobe by sensory nerves located in the forebrain, and it responds to the information. So this is how we can detect the smell, basically with the help of the olfactory receptors present in the nose. and the information is then carried to the brain. The next question and the last question that we have is, what is the role of the brain in reflex action? There is no role of brain in reflex action. These involuntary actions are controlled by the spinal cord, which take place immediately without thinking of how to respond to the stimuli. So this is how a reflex action actually works. That was all about nervous system in animals. We will be talking more about nervous system of coordination that happens in basically the coordination that happens in plants in the next video. Thank you so much.